Now, with everything happening in the world, be that the war in Ukraine or the conflict engulfing the Middle East, as well as the potential economic global recession and Trump's sustained tariffs, you might not think that local elections in the United Kingdom are particularly important. However, I would beg to differ because I think these are some of the biggest political developments in the country, not just in decades, but in nearly a century. Take stock of what we've been seeing over the past 24, 36 hours in the country and explain to you in this video how local elections are driving the overall national mood and national identity of the UK. What's happening, therefore, in its overall policy and therefore its place in the world and its foreign policy. There's so many elements here that can be defined by what we see at the grassroots, at the bottom level, and growing up to the top, not because of who's won a few councils or another night for the incumbent government, but because these results reveal something absolutely seismic, that the entire political landscape of the UK is changing, breaking down of the two-party state system that has dominated political culture here for effectively a century. Now, to understand British politics, you have to understand that it's a parliamentary system, not a presidential one, which means you vote for a party, not an individual. And it's that party that governs, and the head of that party rules the country. And more importantly, for years, that local elections have been treated as protest votes by the British public, a chance for angry voters to punish who was ever the incumbent, who was in power, before drifting back to the opposing major party, be that the Labour Party or the Conservatives, at the next general election. People might have flirted with smaller parties locally, but when it came to choosing a government that would define economic policy for the whole country, foreign policy, the big issues, voters tended to return to the two major parties. But what if that assumption is now breaking? And I don't think anything sums it up more than when one friend of mine told me that in a ward of theirs, second place had gone to the monster raving loony party. They beat out Labour, the Tories, the Liberal Democrats, and the Greens. So what we're seeing now is a far more structural shift than temporary. Reform, the party on the further right of the political spectrum led by Nigel Farage, has decimated the English local elections. The party has won the most seats and votes and will end up with well over 1,300 net gains. In over 500 council wards, the party has recorded an average vote share of around 25%. Now, that might not be particularly high, but it's the highest for a party that didn't even really exist a few years ago, and it's well ahead of its rivals. The Greens, which is the further left party of the spectrum, has seen more modest gains, but still seen their best results ever and averaged around 17% in gains. This represents an 8-point increase on when the party saw this kind of support growing in their local elections 4 years ago. Now, interestingly, Reform's gains are concentrated in areas that were heavily backed or backing Brexit a decade ago. Conversely, the Greens are consolidating support amongst younger, urban, social liberal voters. Labour has lost support in multiple directions at once, and the Conservatives increasingly look trapped between a sort of sense of irrelevance, but also absorption by reform. Over the months and years since the 24 election, we've seen more Conservative MPs defect to reform. For Labour, on average, their vote is down by 18 points of 2022 and 2024, and support for the Conservatives down by 11 points in that same time frame, where they lost more than half the seats that they were defending. And so this magnifies just how bad each is, even if the figures are slightly different. It shows relative to where they were years before, just how bad it is. And so underneath all of these statistics and figures is something deeper: the rejection of conventional politicians and their method of governing. This election was in many ways a rejection of anyone who sounds too polished, too rehearsed, too managerial, of which many people feel that Sir Keir Starmer, the current Prime Minister, is. Voters distrust people who feel overly manufactured by Westminster. Nigel Farage of Reform and Zach Polanski, the leader of the Green Party, have cultivated outsider identities. Their supporters believe they mean what they say, and therefore people may strongly disagree with them ideologically, but they do not see them as empty political brands. And in an age of, say, cynicism, authenticity increasingly matters more than moderation, because authenticity means legitimacy. 5 parties are now polling at pretty meaningful levels nationally, and that's not something Britain has ever seen. But beneath that chaos, there is still some recognizable structure, actually, in terms of the voting intention. Most voters are not actually switching across ideological camps. They're just switching within them. On the one side sits this socially liberal bloc. Labour, the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, which is centre-left, the SNP or Scottish Nationalist Party, which is a nationalist party for Scotland, and Plaid Cymru, the Nationalist Party for Wales. On the other side, though, sits that more socially conservative, Brexit-supporting bloc, increasingly divided between the Conservatives, the centre, centre-right, and Reform, the right, in some people's eyes, far-right parties. And that's crucial to understand because it explains why Brexit, the massive decision that the UK made 10 years ago, still matters. People talk about Brexit as though it ended in 2020. And politically, though, it never really did, because Brexit fundamentally rewired British politics and the way people approach it. For instance, in 2017 and 19, Labour and the Conservatives temporarily recovered because they became the vehicles for the two sides of that divide. Leave for the Conservatives versus Remain for sort of Labour. But now the Brexit divide still exists while the two major parties themselves lose the legitimacy and people want genuine shifts and change. That's why these elections matter, because once voters begin to see challenger parties as viable, the psychology changes completely. If you can break through that mental barrier, your voting intention follows. Voting for Reform or Greens no longer feels like a wasted vote. And once that mental barrier breaks, it becomes difficult, largely impossible to reverse. People like choice. Not too much choice, but choice. And it makes me think of what Britain did when it rejected the political fragmentation once before. You see, in 2019, the UK voted heavily against changing the electoral system towards proportional representation, largely because both Labour and the Conservatives defended the traditional two-party model at the time. They benefited from the first-past-the-post system and therefore rejected it. But 15 years later, the electorate itself increasingly appears to be forcing a multi-party system into existence anyway. Britain is gradually becoming much more resemblant of the fragmented continental political systems. Not yet to the level of, say, the Netherlands with its highly autonomized coalition politics, but perhaps closer towards something like Germany. Multiple meaningful parties competing inside broader ideological camps. And eventually pressure may build not just to the change of the parties, but the whole voting system. As I say, fast past the post has defined British politics, but it may well be pushed further because of how deeply interconnected it is to Britain's economic geography and the growing national imbalance. For years, Britain sold itself as this globally connected success story, a financial centre, a flexible economy, a bridge between Europe and America. But after Brexit, COVID, inflation, multiple conflicts, energy shocks, and years of weak productivity especially, large parts of the country increasingly feel that the British model doesn't work for them. London and parts of the southeast remain globally integrated and prosperous, while many northern towns, midland towns, coastal communities, and smaller cities increasingly feel economically disconnected, culturally alienated from the direction of the country. And that disconnect feeds that political anger. Many voters increasingly feel Britain talks like a post-national economy while living through this perpetual state of decline. To them, Westminster is completely out of touch, focusing on sort of managerial language, symbolic politics, political correctness, and an unwillingness to say what is needed or do what is needed to be done to rebuild infrastructure, invest in the right areas, and project a sense of national confidence. So it helps explain why Reform is rising in one direction whilst the Greens rise in another. The Greens' growth reflects how issues like Palestine and climate increasingly shape political identity, especially amongst younger and minority voters. Conversely, Reform's rise reflects the concern over migration, sovereignty, a sense of sort of embarrassment of a national identity, and a growing Britain first mentality. It's not simply left versus right anymore. It's increasingly a clash of overall identities, values, and competing visions of Britain itself. And that has consequences, therefore, not just domestically, but of course, internationally. These are technically local elections. The fragmentation, though, reveals the inevitable spills into foreign policy. For decades, Britain maintained a sense of stability. a consistent, coherent foreign policy of, regardless of who was governed, support for NATO, the Atlanticism, free trade, liberal internationalism, and Britain's role as a sort of globally engaged middle power and a desire to be seen as a leader in certain areas. But Reform's rise is pushing parts of the British politics to a much more sovereignty-focused, transactional foreign policy with greater scepticism toward migration, climate commitments, or international institutions, much more reflective of Donald Trump's style, albeit more diluted. Conversely, the Greens and the broader progressive left prioritize issues like Palestine, climate-centered diplomacy, and skepticism towards militarization or even NATO, at a time, though, when it seems increasingly important that we do support these methods, including increasing defense spending and defying threats from the bigger powers. That creates something Britain has not experienced for decades then, a genuine foreign policy polarization. And it is happening at perhaps the worst possible geopolitical moment. The global order is much harsher now. The US is completely unpredictable. Europe is seeking to exert its own interests and portray its own ideas across the world. Russia remains revisionist and China is much more assertive. Trade wars, industrial competition return and largely define things. And so this is exactly the kind of period which is where you need internal cohesion, economic confidence, and long-term strategic planning. Instead, Britain looks completely the opposite, with political fragmentation, economically uncertain, and conflict over its own identity and direction. And then there's the question of the union itself. If Scotland moves once again towards separatism under the revived SNP, the implications extend far beyond constitutional politics. Britain's nuclear deterrent is based in Scotland. The broader GI-UK gap, or Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, remains one of NATO's most important strategic corridors for monitoring Russian naval activities and therefore threats to the broader transatlantic security theatre. So if the UK itself enters a prolonged period of political fragmentation and declining confidence in its traditional institutions, then that matters very much for Moscow, not only Washington or Westminster. Because arguably the greatest assumption of British politics is that it was always about stability, regardless of the crises, be it political, military, economic. The system broadly held together. But these elections revealed just how polarized and fragmented the UK now is. A lot of it will largely depend on what the two main traditional parties can do, whether they recapture a clearer sense of identity, whether they are able to flesh out clearer defined policies, whether they have leaders that are willing to take risks and push the boat out in terms of standing up for clearly defined principles and values. Things are not going to collapse overnight, but if they don't, then that erosion will slowly and structurally, but likely permanently, define British politics. And that's why these elections matter so much more than we think. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll be back with some particular coverage from some special guests over the next few days to look at this in the bigger picture. But as for now, do like the video, subscribe, and let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Take care.